Hello again, and welcome to this week's episode of Lit Up with Green Flame. Last week we spent a full episode looking at the power of reading, so I thought that for this week's episode we could change the pace a little bit and turn our attention to writing. Later in the episode, I'll map out a simple writing activity that can be used by a solo writer or one which you could use with your class. So to keep things interesting, I decided to focus on a genre of fiction that most children, and actually some adults, might be less familiar with. It's called Magical Realism. A magical realism story is a little bit like fantasy, but with some interesting differences. Small moments of magic occur, but the characters and even the narrator don't draw attention to them. In Magical Realism, the fantastical is as normal and unexpected as rainfall or a kettle. Here's a simple way to think about it. What if something magical happened and no one in the story said anything? Without having to explain anything about the magic, you can let the story unfold on its own. It's kind of perfect for a short story format. And to understand this a little bit more fully, I've made a short sort of magical realist story to demonstrate the idea a little. After the story, I'll explain magical realism in a bit more detail, and then we can look at a writing activity that you can have that will go with it. So this story is called Broken Window. Lewis left the house. He didn't bother to call out bye. After all, he was the last one out. He checked that he still had his key in his bag, then pulled the front door closed, listening for the click of the lock as it slid into place. An echoing click sounded on his shoulder, and he reached up to tickle Miranda's chin. Miranda was a soft, silver-grey-coloured cockatiel parrot with a bright yellow crest and peachy orange cheek markings. That was her favourite spot for a tickle. Lewis reached into his pocket and lifted out a sunflower seed for her to nibble. The seed husk fell into Lewis's collar, and he wriggled to let it flop out from his untucked shirt and out onto the pavement. Right, come on girl, better get to school. I could do with some breakfast. Lewis was always first in the door for the breakfast club at school. It was the best way to be sure of a bowl of porridge and a piece of fruit from the top of the pile, which Miranda was always more than happy to share. They were about halfway to the school when they came to the supermarket. Miranda's weakness. Sure enough, she was off his shoulder and flying towards the fruit stand just inside the doors before Lewis could react. Unfortunately, someone else got a surprise from the random cockatiel flying towards the supermarket. A woman in a summery dress and a pink flowery bike helmet was pulling up to the side of the supermarket in her electric bike, and must have mistaken the accelerator for the brake in all the confusion. She surged towards the glass door in an eruption of glass and noise. Miranda was thrown into a panic and launched herself back to the safety of Lewis's hair, a very clawing and spiky experience for Lewis. Lewis hurried over to check on the woman as some of the shop staff came out from inside. She seemed okay, but her bike was as mangled as the shop door. Lewis helped her up. Are you okay? Are you hurt? The woman smiled. I'm fine, thanks. I'm glad your wee bird is okay too. I thought I was going to hit it. Lewis looked up at the bird, nestled deep in his hair. She's pretty nimble. I think she was hoping to sneak in and steal a strawberry. Maybe the wee fright will make her think twice about shoplifting in future. In her continued panic, Miranda laid an egg. It rolled off Lewis's head and clunked onto the tile floor of the supermarket doorway. Ha! She hasn't done that in a while. She doesn't have a mate, so she just lays these little, heavy, golden ones. No babies for her. The lady looked at the little golden egg. That's a shame. I hear silver cockatiels are pretty rare. Lewis nodded, happy to meet someone who knew what sort of bird Miranda was. Most people just called her a parrot or a cockatoo or sometimes even a budgie. Yeah, she's called Miranda. He tried to introduce her, but the little silver bird was still hiding in his hair. I keep her close because she's a bit fearful on her own. You can keep the egg if you like. I've got a few back home anyway. The egg was small, but made of solid gold. The lady smiled and sighed. That's a relief. I won't need to call my insurance or anything. I'll probably pay for the door as well. Lewis lifted his eyebrows. I didn't realise they were worth this much. Maybe I should take mine to the bank sometime. Anyway, are you sure you're okay? The lady nodded, satisfied. Lewis continued on his way. After all, there was a warm bowl of porridge and a banana with his name on it. Maybe a strawberry for Miranda too. As you can see, magical realism feels a little like fantasy, but with a slightly different tone to it. If you're looking for a fresh way to spark creativity in your writing, or that of your class, then it doesn't hurt to change the parameters sometimes. Whether you're a writer trying to shake off some cobwebs or a teacher hoping to add a new twist to a class activity, what follows might help you. If you're sharing this with your class, it kind of helps to start with a clear idea of what a genre is. For what we'll be working on today, it'll be sufficient to say that a genre is a category of story. Book genres include categories like fantasy, sci-fi, mystery, and many more. Literary fiction is a genre often found on university reading lists. It can sometimes be seen as the more serious side of storytelling. And one of its subgenres, magical realism, mixes everyday life with magical moments in a way that is fascinating and quite different from typical fantasy books. The magic is subtle, unspoken, and completely mixed in with the ordinary and the everyday. Genre fiction is a term typically used for all the books that live in their own worlds outside of literary fiction. Genre fiction tends to dominate bookshop shelves. These are the books that readers seek out because they already love that type of story, whether it's a crime book, novels, fantasy, romance, or horror. Genre fiction is easy to advertise and it's fairly easy to describe. And unlike a genre fiction category like fantasy, magical realism isn't about big magical worlds or epic quests. Instead, it features magic that's accepted as part of daily life, whilst never being fully explained. The magic isn't the focus. It's just part of the world. I first came across magical realism thanks to a high school teacher of mine, Mr. Johnson, and I was hooked. Some fantasy authors like Terry Pratchett have poked fun at magical realism. In fact, Terry Pratchett once joked that saying you write magical realism is a polite way of saying you write fantasy. And I can see what he means, but there is a clear difference between the two. Magical realism is a literary style famously associated with Latin American writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Jorge Luis Borges, and Isabel Allende. The most notable element of the genre is that when magic or fantastical events occur in an otherwise ordinary setting, so no one within the story takes much notice of it, including the narrator. In magical realism, the magic is ordinary. It's not questioned, characters don't wonder how it works, they don't even point it out. The narrator treats it like toast popping out of a toaster, normal and unremarkable. The focus is always on the human experience. Even if there's a ghost living in a tree or someone floating into the sky, it's all part of the background, not the point of the story. So take 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It includes flying grandmothers, ghosts, and prophetic scrolls, all treated as normal parts of life. And that's magical realism. So, is it just literary fantasy? It can feel that way. Books like The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley or Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi clearly feature magic. However, they focus on people, relationships, and daily life, not on magic systems or world building. That's also probably why they're considered literary fiction. They treat the magic as a background, not as plot. Even Terry Pratchett, who jokes around about magical realism, often blurred the lines himself. Pratchett's Discworld books sometimes let magical elements go significantly unexplained. What's more, every single Pratchett book I've ever read gives a deep and clear connection to the human, or troll, or dwarf, or golem, or even lowly goblin components of the story. All of this lets some of Pratchett's own work edge ever so closely into magical realist territory. Other books for younger readers do this too. Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials and Garth Nix's Keys to the Kingdom series both dip into this space. They sometimes avoid explaining how the magic works, letting the mystery remain. All of this said, magical realism in children's books is rare. So why is that? Kids are still figuring out how the real world works, and depending on their age, they'll need some explanation about almost everything that happens in a story, whether it's real or magical. Plus, learning how magic works can be a fun part of the story in itself. In my own books, Jack starts out in our world and learns about magic bit by bit. Some things are left unexplained, but I explain enough to keep younger readers clued in. That much explanation is definitely more like traditional fantasy than something like magical realism. So, are there any magical realist children's books? The one exception to the seeming rule about the difficulties of creating magical realism for kids is, at least in my opinion, Roald Dahl. His stories often treat magic as normal, but his gritty, sometimes unpleasant, real-world details make his stories feel oddly grounded as well. Roald Dahl's writing is so distinctive that I'll be exploring it in more detail in a later post. Fantastical stories lift us out of the everyday, but they do it in a way that helps us see human behaviour more clearly. Whether we're worried about a basilisk in the basement of the school, a ghoulish creature hiding in our garden, a dog that somehow switches off all devices nearby, or if we're gingerly climbing the slopes of Mount Doom, all of these experiences make their own sort of sense, and we can see the real human parts all the clearer when everything else seems strange. Magical realism, in contrast to fantasy, holds on tight to the mystery of how the magic works. For some young readers, that might feel unsatisfying. However, it's still strange enough to make the feelings of the characters stand out all the stronger. With this in mind, we can write magical realism with considerably less explanation than a fantasy story. You can basically jump straight into the strangeness and show the real human emotions all the more clearly. Here's a writing activity for you to try. The Magical Object Writing Challenge. You can run this writing challenge just by listening to this episode, but I also have a classroom printout and a teacher's slide resource available on the website. You'll find download links in the original post in the section where this activity is described. So here's the activity. Part 1. Give your main character a magical object. It can be weird, strange, or subtle. It doesn't even have to be an object. It could be a creature of some sort, like you'll have seen in my story. And here's a tip for part 1. To imagine how to use your magical object, it can help to think about how we might describe something more ordinary. So think of something like a phone. Most of us don't fully understand how a phone works, but a single phone can have some fairly big effects on a story, without you having to explain the workings of it. Part 2. The character doesn't know that this object is magical. They've always had it, and they're so used to what it does that they think it's as ordinary as a pen or a pair of shoes. No one explains it, not even the narrator. And here's a tip for part 2. To make this easier for yourself, avoid naming the object in the title of your story and kind of avoid describing it early on. Let it blend into the story naturally. Part 3. Write a story about an ordinary day. Come up with something dramatic yet ordinary that could be going on. Show the object doing something unusual, but don't explain how or why. Here's a tip for part 3. Your magical object can be part of the solution, but be sure to look at the feelings of the people in the story more than you talk about the object. Part 4. Focus on how it affects people. What are all the main characters feeling at the end of your story? And here's a tip for part 4. A story's conclusion is often when there is an emotional change. The more dramatic the change, the more dramatic the ending. Anger to joy, sadness to humour. You can decide what feelings you'd like to see your characters show. Here's an extra note, if you choose to use the worksheets that are provided. So the quadrants on the worksheet don't have to be in the order that your story goes in. So once you have notes for parts 1, parts 2, 3 and 4, you could grab a separate piece of paper or your jotter and write up your story there. This way, the notes from part 3, for example, could be used as your beginning, followed by the object ideas that you noted in part 1. You can use notes from part 2 to help you move the story along, whilst remembering to keep the magic subtle, and then finish your story using the notes from part 4. The order in which you use your 4 sets of notes is completely up to you, and it might change the rhythm of the story. This writing constraint helps sharpen your storytelling, and it also introduces students to the style and feel of a new, possibly unfamiliar genre of story in a fun and hopefully accessible way. Finally, what did your story teach you about yourself? It can feel strange to restrict your writing like this. One of the amazing things about writing fiction is how wild and open it can all feel. With a blank page in front of you, you can take the story literally anywhere. However, sometimes that freedom can be a bit of a problem. So when you have too many choices, just making a single choice can feel like the hard part of your storytelling. Cutting your options down with something like the writing challenge we've just looked at can force you to sharpen up what you want to say and the sort of story that you want to tell. This can tell you a little bit about how you felt when you were writing that story as well. If you chose something creepy, for example, maybe you needed a little scare to wake up your brain a bit. Perhaps your story had a little sadness in it, so maybe you needed a chance to let out something that's been upsetting you. Or maybe you just went for a humorous story, so you maybe just needed a laugh. Writing fiction lets you deal with real emotions in imaginary ways, and magical realism offers a slightly different way to do that than more traditional genres. I hope you enjoyed the activity, and sometime soon I'll be adding a portion to the podcast where I showcase listeners' stories, so feel free to share your story using the contact links that you'll find on social media and on the website. And please please get in touch to let me know how you or your class got on with the writing activity. I'd really love some feedback. And feel free to answer a few other questions as well if you want to get involved in the magical realism topic. So do you know of any children's books that feel truly magical realist beyond the kind of Roald Dahl ones I referenced? Which book genre do you think translates well to children's books and which ones don't? Feel free to let me know in the comments or message me on Instagram. You could even use this as an additional in-class activity, sort of moving on from the writing activity to something where we kind of analyse our reading. And thank you for listening in to the podcast today. You can grab a copy of my own children's fantasy book, Jack Rooson and the Fae Flame, by following the links on my social media profiles and on my main website. And also remember to subscribe to this vlog/podcast to avoid missing future episodes. I'll see you again next week, and don't forget to send in your stories. I'm always happy to share good tales on the podcast, and I welcome any submissions by writers of all ages. Try to keep submissions under 500 words, makes it easier for me to fit it into a podcast episode, and I'll confirm any permissions for readings that are going to be read aloud before I put them onto the podcast. I'll see you again next week. Thanks again for listening in. All the best. Bye.